Hi everyone, it's Mr. Pinkerton. In this video, we're going to talk about bacteria structure and reproduction. So you might remember last week we talked about the three domains of life. We have the bacteria, which are here, and the archaea, and the eukaryotic organisms. Now, mostly we're going to be talking today about bacteria, though there are some similarities with archaea in terms of structure and in terms of reproduction, but mostly we'll be talking about bacteria. So you might remember from the very beginning of the year we talked about cell structure, and mostly we looked at eukaryotic cell structure, and those were really complicated cells with lots of different organelles. But the bacteria structure is really pretty simple. Now remember, these are really small cells. They're a lot smaller than eukaryotic cells. And you'll see the basic structure is this. There's a cell wall on the outside. This is sort of the cell wall. And inside that cell wall, there's a plasma membrane. Sometimes we call that a cell membrane. This is the plasma membrane. Notice that it's inside the cell wall. Now let's have a look at the DNA. Here's the DNA. Now the DNA in bacteria is in the form of a chromosome. Remember, there's no nucleus. These are prokaryotic organisms, and there's no nucleus, but there is a chromosome, and that chromosome is made up of DNA and proteins. Some bacteria have this. This is a flagellum, and it's used to help move the bacterium around. And also to help move the bacteria are these pili, or pilus singular. Notice that the bacteria also has ribosomes to help it make proteins, and that is the basic structure of a bacterium. Again, very small, very simple, no nucleus. Now, how is it that bacteria reproduce? We've spent a lot of time talking about sexual reproduction, but with bacteria, there are no gametes, there's no zygote, there's no sperm or egg, and they reproduce quite simply. In fact, bacteria reproduce through a process called binary fission. Now, binary is a word that means two, and fission is a word that means to divide. So binary fission means to divide into two. Binary fission is very similar to mitosis and cytokinesis, something else we learned about earlier in the year, and this is a good review. This is really small, but you can see this is a picture of mitosis here with cytokinesis, the cell dividing into two. You have your prophase and your metaphase here lining in the middle, the anaphase and the telophase. And binary fission is very similar to mitosis and cytokinesis. It's a form of asexual reproduction. Again, there's no sex involved here. This is asexual. And in English, when you put an A in front of a word, it means not. So asexual means not sexual reproduction. The interesting thing, too, is that every new cell is an exact copy of the parent. They are clones. So when a cell divides, when a bacterial cell divides, it forms an identical cell to itself. So every other cell that also divides from that will become identical cells. But the bacteria cells keep dividing into two and keep dividing into two, and before you know it, you've got a whole bacterial colony. And this is what a colony might look like, and you might remember if you got a chance to look at the microscopes the other day, this is what a bacterial colony looks like. You have lots of cells, and they're all identical copies of all the other cells. So here's a diagram of how it works. You've got a single cell with the chromosome here, and this little piece here is called a plasmid. It's another little piece of DNA. We don't need to worry about that now. And there are ribosomes. But look what happens. The DNA is copied. This is the process of DNA replication, like we learned about earlier in the year. The DNA is replicated. Then the cell grows and gets a lot bigger, and it starts to pinch here in the middle and starts to divide. And then the cell wall and the cell membrane form across here, and then now we have two identical cells. So it's really just a matter of splitting and copying itself. Notice here when the cell grew, it also produced more ribosomes so that the new cell could have more ribosomes. Now here's a video of binary fission in action.
Bacteria reproduce very simply and rapidly by doubling their contents and splitting in two. Just one bacterium, dividing every 20 minutes, could produce nearly 5,000 billion bacteria in one day.
So you can see that bacteria grow very, very quickly. Now we need to ask this question about how they become resistant. And we talked about resistance meaning a bacteria becoming stronger. They become resistant to antibiotics. Because if all the bacteria in a colony, here's our colony, if they're genetically identical to each other and they're not resistant, how then do they become resistant? Well, as we've learned earlier too, here's something else we've learned about. DNA can change in some cells. And what do we call that sort of change? We call that a mutation. So the DNA can change just randomly in a cell. No reason. Sometimes there might be some exposure environmentally that causes it to change, but sometimes it's just a random change. And if you look here, we can see the DNA, there's a mutation here. So these nucleotides here, that's different here than it is here. So that is a mutation that can occur in bacteria. Bacteria can also get DNA from other bacteria. It's called conjugation, and here's a picture here. These two bacteria are next to each other and this little tiny bridge forms. This little tube can form and they can share DNA. Now it's not the same as sexual reproduction, but they can share DNA. So this bacterium here might get new DNA from this bacteria here. Now, here's the point. If the changed or new DNA causes the bacteria to become resistant to an antibiotic, it will survive and grow while the other bacteria will die. And in this case, the resistant bacteria have adapted. They've changed or evolved. They've changed over time, and this is the process of natural selection. So here's a bacterium that's become resistant to the antibiotic and is chasing after it. So again, a change caused by mutation can cause a bacterium to be resistant to an antibiotic, and that's the one that's going to survive. All the rest of them are going to die off. Here's another graphic that shows this. Here's our non-resistant bacteria. This one's fine. It's not resistant to antibiotics. They're going to multiply, and again, they can form billions and billions of new cells in one day. But occasionally there's a mutation here, and here's our little mutant. And this mutant might be resistant to the antibiotic. And here's what happens. In the presence of the drug, in the presence of an antibiotic, the resistant ones survive. And what happens to them? They continue to grow and thrive. And this is what has caused some of the problems that we've talked about and what caused the problems in the video that we looked at earlier.